This is the story of an experience I had in Cradle Mountain National Park in Tasmania, Australia, in my early teens. Despite causing no physical injury, it has haunted me into adulthood. I grew up in a family of avid hikers, both my mother, a botanist, and my father, a biologist for the University of Tasmania, would regularly visit the deepest wilderness areas of Tasmania during their field studies. These trips were disguised as camping and hiking adventures for the family. I never minded, as I was just as passionate about the outdoors as they were, even from a young age. Key word being was, as after what I went through, even 20+ years later, I still refused to return. We lived on a property a short distance from Lake St. Clair, a popular tourist destination. This was the only place my parents would allow me to camp and experience the wilderness alone, as long as I brought my German Shepherd with me. He was a former police dog and very well trained. At 12 or 13 years old, I didn't mind. It felt like my own little slice of freedom, in my own little slice of wilderness, despite being surrounded by people. It was easy enough to ignore them, but as I got older and more brazen, I found myself hounding my parents to let me take my quad bike deeper into the park to camp, to test my own abilities and prove to them that I was capable of doing so, and that I wasn't a little kid anymore. It was that overconfidence that led me to that situation and caused me this trauma. I was 15 at the time of the experience, at the age where I thought I was invincible, knew all there was to know, and was untouchable. After asking my parents for what felt like an uncountable number of times and being told no just as many times, I'd had enough and decided to just go. I told my parents that I and a few friends were going to the lake to camp and do some fishing over the weekend. Instead, I took my tent, my quad, and headed into the reserve. I just left after sunrise to maximize daylight and to make it as far in as I felt comfortable. Once arriving, I set up camp, had some food, and decided to go for an explore. I knew of a spot nearby with a gorgeous rock face where fossils had been found in the past, so I thought I'd try my luck. Shortly into the walk, I realized I'd been turned around and had no idea where I was anymore. At the time, I didn't see it as that big of a deal, as I had a compass and knew that if I headed south, it would take me back to the lake, and I could walk from there. However, by this time, it was getting late in the afternoon, so, stupidly, I decided to try my chances and make it back to my camp and quad bike, so I wasn't walking back to camp from the lake in the dark. Big mistake. It was about 4:30 p.m., and the sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting dark shadows across my walking path. That's when the forest went silent. And when I say silent, I mean silent. No wind, no birds, no forest sounds at all, which made my heart rate skyrocket. It was getting dark, and the silence was suffocating. I just wanted to get back to my camp, light a fire, eat some snacks, and spend the night watching nature's television until I fell asleep. That's when, from every direction, I would hear the sound of twigs cracking and something moving in the canopy above me. No big deal, probably birds or other small animals, I thought. But then, as clear as day, "Hey, come here." At first, I felt relieved, as I thought someone along the trails had seen me, noticed I was a bit disheveled, and wanted to help. But looking around, I saw no one. Then it happened again, but behind me this time, the same voice, but I noticed it was coming from up in the trees. I responded, "I can't see you, where are you?" and asked for some help because I thought I just couldn't see the person calling out. But then it happened again, from to my left this time. That's when I decided to run. I took off into the brush and ran a good 2 minutes before I stopped to catch my breath and look at my compass to start making my way towards the lake. I was terrified, but felt I'd covered enough distance that I wasn't in immediate danger. But seconds after checking my compass and starting to walk, I heard it again. "Hey, come here." But this time, it was right behind me. I spun around and saw absolutely nothing, so I began sprinting again and didn't stop. The last thing I heard before bursting out of the trees onto the lakefront was the most evil, demonic laugh I had ever heard. It sounded like 3 people laughing at once. I immediately called my parents to come and get me. I told them what I did and what happened, but they were more focused on my disobedience than my experience. The moment they picked me up was the first time I felt relief, and I cried the whole drive home. I didn't sleep properly for days. My dad went and picked up my quad and tidied up my camp. Since that day, I haven't stepped foot away from the lake. If anyone has had an experience like this, I'd love to hear it, because it took my passion from me. I miss being out, away from society, but I can't bring myself to do it. About 8 years ago, 2 buddies and I decided to spend the night camping at Palo Duro Canyon. We're from Amarillo, Texas, so it's less than 20 miles away. This is the second largest canyon in the US next to the Grand Canyon. And while you may be wondering what kind of spooky shit we may have run into as young kids of just 17 years of age, this isn't necessarily that kind of story. Instead, us 3 friends were some of the only around our age that we knew that didn't indulge in partying. No drinking, getting stoned, nothing of that nature. So, of course we think a perfect getaway on a Friday night would be the canyon. We didn't even own camping supplies. We just went to Walmart and bought some and headed out on a whim. We make the drive and get to the state park at around 5 p.m. We enter the gate and set off to find a spot to pitch a few tents. We pull into this campsite area that has 2 separate canopies with picnic tables and respective grills for cooking. In the middle of both canopies, a fire pit. Nobody was there, so we thought it was the perfect place to set up camp. We brought some coolers with soda, some hot dogs and hamburgers to grill, and a stereo to jam some tunes while we hung out and enjoyed the last few hours of daylight in the Texas summer heat. After we pitched our tents, a truck with a small camper RV moseyed on into the site. A man and a woman got out and surveyed the area. The man saw us and waved with that friendly Texan hospitality. We waved back, of course, and went on about our business. We ate dinner, and the sun was starting to set. I noticed that the man and woman didn't pitch a tent, and that they probably just intended on staying in their camper. We built a fire and sat around it in some portable chairs we brought, and I saw the man walking towards us. He introduced himself as Doug, and said that he cooked a lot of extra food if we wanted any. We politely declined and told him we had already eaten, but we appreciated the offer. He said, "Hey, as long as you guys have eaten, it's no big deal." He waved again and set back off to his camp. About an hour later, he comes back with a brown paper bag and comments on the music we were listening to. Says how back in the 70s, he went to all these festivals, and basically just rambles on how it's awesome that we're so young and still keeping classic rock alive. He notices that my friends have guitars and actually yells over to his wife to come on over. By this point, we don't think anything weird of it. We just didn't know him or his wife, and he was obviously drinking and just invited themselves into our space. None of us had the spine to say anything to him about it, so we all just sat around the fire trading stories, as much as 3 17-year-old boys can, with a couple probably in their late 50s to early 60s. After what seemed like a lifetime of bullshitting stories with these people we don't know, he starts trying to get to know us on a more personal level. Really polite, but obviously a bit drunk. He asks us if we have jobs, or if we're in school, and we all reply. He says that he works at a United supermarket as a stalker, and has been for the last 15 years. He basically says that if any of us need a job at any time, that if we put him as a reference, he could get us on. He says his full name for us to reference, just in case any one of us wants to apply. This is important for later. Anyways, finally the wife starts nodding off, all liquored and bundled up. She fell asleep in her chair. Luckily, that was the cue for Doug to get her back to camp and put her to bed. When they walk off back to their site, the three of us look at each other and eye-rolled because we were all such doormats and basically let this stranger come ruin our night. We see that it's close to midnight, so we decide to put out the fire and get ready for bed. Doug trots back over to our site. He asks us if we're here all weekend or not. We told him we only had enough money to stay for the one night, and that we'd be heading back to town in the morning. He said he really enjoyed the company, and that he'd personally pay for us to stay another night if we wanted to. We politely declined his offer, and he started back off to his RV. He quickly turns back around and says, "Remember guys, if any of you need a job, just call up to United on Gem Lake Road and tell them Doug Manson sent you." We smiled and said thanks, and he left for good that time. That night actually got considerably cold, and we decided to pack up and head back to our warm beds in town at around 4 a.m. As we were leaving the canyon, we almost hit a deer and veered off the road. Everyone was okay, but we were definitely shocked because it was so late and we had gotten no sleep at that point. Us almost hitting the deer was practically the climax of our trip to the canyon that weekend, and we all continued back to school on Monday like normal. One of my friends that was with me on the camping trip was actually in my third period class on Monday, and we started talking about how that guy Doug and his wife were pretty cool, despite not taking the hint that we didn't care to hang out with them. I asked my buddy if he could remember Doug's last name, and somehow he did. So I Googled him. Big mistake. Guess who was a 10 times over registered sex offender, who almost all of his victims were boys from ages 12 to 17. You guessed it, Doug. This rocked our world. We had somehow, some way, just barely escaped the clutches of this disgusting man. What would have happened to us if we took his offer to stay another night? I was so suspicious of this guy and couldn't get the scenario out of my mind that I decided to call United Supermarket to tell the manager that one of his employees was being really creepy to us kids and that he might want to be wary of the people that he hires. And guess what? Nobody by Doug's name has ever worked for United. He bullshitted us all night long, trying to get us drunk to do God knows what to us innocent kids. Be careful of who you talk to. To pay off the mortgage, my family built 2 granny flats in our backyard and have been renting both out. At first, this concept was terrifying. Strangers living on our land. It felt like a blatant invasion of my privacy. Fortunately, the real estate agent and my dad both found kind old men to live in either granny flats. Now we were familiar with one of the men, as he was previously living in our neighborhood, and he would greet us if we walked past each other or engage in small talk. The only issue was that he's a non-functional alcoholic, but he's always been kind, to me at least, despite having some bad, horrible habits, racism, homophobic, whatever else, and that often gets him into trouble, resulting in my mom having to patch him up after a solid beating, and him being disowned by his family. My parents, who were immigrants themselves, tend to look over his views and even lowered his rent out of pity. We honestly thought he was a good guy, merely a victim of circumstance. The first red flag for me was when he coaxed me into coming into his granny flat under the ruse of finding his phone. Instead, he locked the doors and proceeded to show me his stash of opioids and injectables, and trying to engage in conversation about various medical issues, since I have a medical background and he was previously a night nurse. In order to escape, I had to call my brother without the tenant and leave the call running so my brother could hear me ask to be let outside and overhear the conversation. Being a victim of SA twice left my family fairly shaken up. Since then, I have refused to engage with this tenant alone. Recently, the final straw for my family came when we started noticing some odd things inside our house. My dad found blood in his room that no one could explain. I would hear footsteps inside the house when I was alone during the day, and simultaneously causing our little puppy to go into guard dog mode. A mere 2 hours ago, my mom was home from work, which was unusual for her, and she suddenly hears the door open, someone step in and sit down on the couch. From my mother's recollection, she ducked inside the pantry and watched as our trustworthy tenant walked around our house, avoiding rooms that had noise emitting from them, i.e. my brother is home due to injury, watching TV, and our dog is in there too. However, he did peek into my room while I was sleeping, which is directly opposite the kitchen and visible to my mom, before he sat back down on the couch. My mom soon confronted him, kicked him out, and regained composure from what she could only describe as a near damn heart attack before going to his granny flat. The man had no recollection of entering our home 10 minutes ago, playing dumb with the lines such as, "Was I really in your house? Did I do that? I don't remember doing anything wrong." What's evident is that this wasn't the first, second, or third time. This is one of the scariest stories I've ever heard, so here it is. This story was told in our family when I was growing up. It used to scare me so bad. Anyway, my mama swore it was the truth, and she was not known to tell lies, and I should know, because it was just her and I when I was growing up. Anyway, she was born and raised in a very rural and poor area of West Virginia. Her and her 7 or 8 brothers and sisters were very poor. Because of this, and because it was what many country people did, her father raised a garden. Now, my mama nearly idolized her father, and would go with him the distance from their house to the garden spot, which was a good piece off. This required they push a wagon with wooden wheels past their neighbor's house. My mama was terrified of the old woman that lived beside them. Mama said they called her Aunt Kate. She was older and apparently had cataracts because Mama said her eyes were white. Mama said this particular summer was extremely hot, and that she and her father had spent a good bit of time at the garden tending to the vegetables and picking what was ready. As they pushed this big wagon up and in front of Aunt Kate's house, the old woman came out and yelled, "Harrison," who was my great-grandfather, "give me some of them beans you got there." My great-grandfather responded, "Kate, we worked hard for them beans, and we ain't giving them away." The old woman left and said that they would regret their decision. The two proceeded up the hill to their home and went about their chores and other required duties. Mama said that she thought nothing more of it until it was time to sleep. According to my mama, with so many kids, some shared the bed and some on the floor where they slept with minimal coverings. Mama said that she was drifting off to sleep when she heard someone or something walk towards the room where she was sleeping. Knowing the sounds of the home, she did not recognize who or what it could be. Mama always talked about how her father would tell them stories to scare them into being good. Due to this, she was easily scared. As the walking got closer, She reported covering her head and laying still, terrified of who or what was standing in the doorway. Mama reported that whatever it was would turn and walk out of the room and back down the hallway all night long. She said she laid there all night terrified and scared to take her head out from under the blanket. The next morning, as the sun arose, the thing stopped. She stated that she then heard the familiar sound of her father moving quickly to dress. Once she bolstered enough bravery, she immediately darted down the hallway and into the kitchen, where her father was placing green beans into a sack. The two did not speak, but walked quickly out the door and down the hill to Aunt Kate's house with the sack full of beans. Mama said old Aunt Kate was already out sitting on her porch, as if waiting on them to arrive. Her father said, "Old woman, take your booger back." And Aunt Kate started laughing and telling them, "Don't worry, Harrison, it won't bother you no more." Mama told other things that Aunt Kate did that alluded to her being someone familiar with the dark side. Mama was a very honest Christian lady. Like I had to go to church every time the doors were open, and I never remember a time where I caught her in a lie, or even heard her curse, and she swore Kate was into black magic. Okay, this was several years ago, 2014, but I still think about it occasionally. At the time, I was in the hospital, being treated for depression. It was a normal hospital with a mental facility included. The ward I stayed at was an open ward, so I could leave during the daytime as I pleased, and other people could just walk in, like on other wards. I was there for several months, and thus met a lot of other patients in the facility. Most patients at my ward were perfectly sociable people who just struggled with depression, anxiety, or some form of mild personality disorder. The noticeable insane people suffering from schizophrenia or delusions were treated on other wards, particularly the one that was located one floor above me. That ward was half open, meaning that they had a lockdown, but certain patients were allowed to leave if they fulfilled some criteria. In the facility, I met a patient from the ward, Steve. Steve was around my age, mid-20s, and schizophrenic. He was one of the patients who could leave the ward. He was quite weird, and used to tell me incoherent and unintelligible stuff, but was lucid often enough to just chat with and play chess with, which we did a lot. There wasn't anything that made me too uncomfortable. One afternoon, however, I was really down and preoccupied with my depression, such that I didn't even leave my room. I just stayed in bed. Sometime I get a knock at the door, and my visitor is, you guessed it, Steve. The nurse told him where my room was when he asked for it, which still upsets me. Steve came in and started to talk weirdly about how we were all gods and lost our powers and can regain them. Just nonsense. But as I usually did before, I didn't take his bullshit, but engaged with his thoughts and objected here and there. He was standing in my room, and I was just lying in bed. Suddenly he came closer to my bed, like really close, basically stood over me. He just stared at me dead in the eye, and said to me in a monotone absent voice, "You are a freely thinking being, and that's why I won't kill you." Not waiting for an answer, he turned and left my room. I freaked out and wondered ever since about the intentions that delusional Steve came to visit me with. Maybe he shouldn't have had the permission to leave his ward after all. I was in this group on Facebook where people shared different kinds of stories, mostly funny stories. I usually post comments there with my dummy account, and most of the people there use dummy accounts as well. I had a fun conversation with this guy using a dummy account named Luffy, who claimed to be 21 years old. We exchanged messages on Facebook without actually adding each other. We both found out that we lived nearby each other, so we decided to meet up and have lunch in a mall near our school. I chose a place to meet where it's really crowded. Since I had a dress rehearsal for a play, he told me that he would wait for me in a burger stand near our school. The night before, we sent each other pictures. I was excited to meet him since he looked pretty fun to hang out with. By 4 p.m., I stood beside the burger stand. A heavily tinted red car stopped at the street in front of me. I then received a text message from him asking me to get inside the car. Since I've read a lot of stories here on Let's Not Meet, I decided to go with my instinct and sent him a text saying that I wouldn't get in the car unless he gets out and shows himself. What happened next made me promise myself that I would never meet anyone from the internet ever again. A man, most likely in his 30s, got out of the car and started to clutch me by my arm and kept tugging me. I screamed like I've never screamed before, making it noticeable since there were civilians there as well. The guy who watched over the burger stand came up to us and asked what was wrong, clearly concerned. "She's my daughter. She's in big trouble. She ran away from home," were this creep's defense. I denied it every time, and the burger guy told him that he would alert the guards from our school. That's when Luffy let go of my arm, got back inside his car, muttered to himself, and drove away. When the guards came, I told them everything, and I was never let out of school after that, without my guardian picking me up. So, Luffy, whoever or wherever the fuck you are, let's not meet again. I was walking out of a Walmart one night, and this guy caught my attention, and he asked me if I can give him a ride. I didn't know this person, and I don't give random strangers a ride. He told me he was a truck driver, and he wanted to go back to the gas station across the highway, literally just within walking distance, so he can get to his big rig. I made up some BS excuse so I didn't have to give him a ride. I suggested to him that there's Uber that he can contact for help. He starts yelling at me that it's just a ride and that he needs help. At that point, I just said, "I gotta go," and I quickly turned around and headed to my car. I heard him say, "Okay." I got into my car and sped off. Initially, I felt extremely bad for not giving him a ride, but the way he yelled at me made it seem justified that I said no. I don't give strangers rides unless it's family or friends. Cut to almost a year later. I'm at a restaurant eating lunch. I decided to open up Facebook on my phone. What I saw next just spooked me down to my core. The article showed me a picture of the same guy who asked me for a ride that night, in a mugshot. Turns out he was a running fugitive wanted on several murder charges across the state I live in. One of the scariest things he did to trick people was that he would ask them for a ride, and then when him and his victims were out of sight of everybody, he would then kill them by shooting them, and he strips them of their money and clothing. He then would take their vehicle and travel to the next area to find his next victim. I legit almost choked on my drink when I saw that. Both my parents were military, and so summer meant some sort of camp or program. Well, I got into some local college program where young kids study advanced subjects. The day was over before my mom's workday, so I would take the light rail to the library or sometimes to the local CC. Anyway, it was my first time ever really being alone in a city or in public in general. My parents got me my first cell phone because of all this. They didn't make me scared, but prepared. I sort of did the same thing every day. Got off my stop, go get a burger, and then go to one place or the other. A couple of times I noticed a man would walk behind me. He'd also be at the local quick market by the burger place. He never tried to talk to me or do anything like that. But after the fourth time I noticed, I called my mom, and she told me people are just going about their day, on a schedule like I am, so it could just be a coincidence. Well, one day I decided to eat inside the burger place instead of take it to go. I saw him walking outside and straight toward the way I would normally go. But before he got out of the parking lot, he started looking around, like he was looking for someone or something. I went to the bathroom, called my mom, and told her to get me. I didn't go that way ever again after that. I took a new route. About a week or so later, the news spoke about a girl who'd gone missing, and the video footage was from the same strip center as the burger place. Yeah, the suspect was the man who had been following me. I used to work in private security. For a bit, I worked at a shopping mall. My partner and I had a feeling this place was haunted. One reason being the homicide that happened right before I was hired. The very west of the mall made the hair on my neck stand up the most, and I don't know why. It's also good to note that there's an animal shelter at this end of the mall. You can see the cats and dogs through the windows at night. They would bark and whine a lot. One night I was walking to that end of the mall, and I started feeling like someone was following me or walking behind me. When I got to the shelter, none of the animals were making noise, but I swear to God, all the ones that were awake were staring at or behind me. I got really bad goosebumps and a horrible feeling in my gut. I put my head down and walked as fast as possible out of the closest door. Once I was outside, all of the negative feelings went away. Hi, I'm a 21-year-old female with a whole bunch of baggage. I've struggled with my mental health my entire life, and last year I was admitted to an acute psychiatric hospital. I've only been recently discharged. Without blogging about my life, I went through some tough, dark times. Luckily I managed to get out, and after 7 admissions, I'm ready to re-enter the world. Anyways, my final admission was to a ward I'd been to a couple of times before. I knew the staff and many of the patients. Sure, it was difficult and tumultuous at times, but most people strived to make it as bearable as possible. The daily routine, at least in UK psych wards, is usually the same. Wake up, take meds, eat food, watch TV, take meds, eat food, take a nap, which is optional, eat food, take meds, go to sleep. You get the gist. It's boring as hell. So one day I came back to my room just after breakfast to see Karen, the usual ward cleaner, standing in my room, staring out of my window and looking fairly startled. Now, when you work as a cleaner on a psych ward, you see some shit, often literally, so I knew something was up. Hey Karen, what's going on? I asked. She explained that while she was cleaning my room, she'd seen a thin, middle-aged man wearing sunglasses and carrying a backpack walk past the room a couple of times. She said that something seemed off about him. I sort of shrugged it off, because he may have well just been a lost patient, as they usually look off. So I went about my day as usual. Then, at around midday, I went to grab something from the window shelf and was suddenly face to face with this middle-aged man wearing glasses and, yeah, a backpack. He didn't look especially freaky, just normal lanky looking. Still, I freaked the fuck out and ran from the room. The windows were tinted, so I'm fairly sure he couldn't have seen me, but it still gave me quite a fright. During the next few days, a number of patients and staff members saw him stalk past numerous windows, which was especially strange because the ward was fenced off, so that the average bystander wouldn't and couldn't find themselves near the unit. We all wondered whether he was just a curious adventurer, or if it was something a bit more sinister. 3 days after the initial encounter, I'd kind of forgotten about the whole thing and went to bed with my window slightly cracked. It wouldn't open the whole way, and the ward was often boiling. I'm aware that I might have imagined this, but I swear that at around 1 a.m., I woke up and heard something tapping on my window. I tried to look through the window, but it was dark, so all I could see was my own reflection. But I freaked the fuck out, shut the window, and told the night staff what was up. That morning, numerous patients were complaining of weird noises during the night, including tapping and sometimes heavy breathing. One girl even swore she heard him or someone try to open her window further. But this was on a psych ward, so I took it with a pinch of salt. Anyway, security was upped for the next few days, and we never saw him again. But yeah, creepy psych ward stalker, let's not meet. My story actually started in 1985. I was with my friend Brian, and we'd just gotten out of school for the day, and we were looking for a new place to trout fish. We had heard of a large bog that was located on townland, and decided to try and find it and try it out. Brian's old 75 Chevy Blazer was able to get us about halfway there, and we walked the rest of the way. We were quite surprised when we arrived at a nice brook, and caught a few fish right off. I decided to go downstream and only went a short way when I was stopped by a large beaver bog. I went back and caught up with my friend who was going upstream. After fishing 100 yards or so, we came to a beautiful round pool and fished it for a while with some success. I finally decided to keep going further up and probably went about 20 yards when I came upon a small opening in the trees, which, like the pool, was round and maybe 30 feet across. Off to the far side, I could see the remains of an old campsite. It struck me as odd when I approached it and saw that whoever had set it up had left everything. An old tent, a rusted saw, sleeping bag, backpack, and even a fishing pole. Wood was stacked for a fire that was never lit, and the pack had clothes and old food stuff. I've seen many campsites, but not like this. It felt like something happened here, and whatever it was, it took place quickly. Then came the quiet. I noticed it as soon as my thoughts had stopped processing what I was seeing. I also realized that one could not see through what I would call a wall of thick alders, except for the small opening that I had come through. Then came the oppressive feeling, the same one that I'd had years later. I can still feel that fear even now as I write this. It just felt bad, very bad. It's you're worried to look over your shoulder feeling that stays with you forever. Just like I'd previously said, there was something there just out of sight. I didn't know what to do. I had never been in a situation like this before. I was grounded and felt helpless. I had no idea how long I was there when I heard walking behind me. It was Brian. I remember him grabbing me and him saying we needed to get the fuck out of there. After we got to the vehicle and left, we talked about anything but what had happened. Truth be told, we never mentioned it ever. This event stayed with me for 25 years until I went back. Never did I dream that events would repeat themselves, but they did. The problem that I'm having now is rather than getting affirmation and closure by sharing my experience, I am now consumed by it. I feel drawn to return, and I guess that I will. I have to. So this was about 5 years ago, and it still creeps me out. I was 18 at the time. I was walking home from work at the local pizza joint, and I took my usual route home. It was about 9:45 to 10:15 p.m., and it was really dark out. As I'm getting about 100 yards away from the street I live on, a white van turns onto that street. Nothing suspicious, but something didn't sit right with me. So I yanked out my earbuds and paused my music. I then turned down my street, and as I'm getting closer to my house, I start getting a really weird gut feeling. I look up from my phone as I was about to text my roommate, who was out of town at the time, that I was almost home. As I look up, I notice the white van sitting in front of my house, and the man inside is just staring at me. The yellow car light shining on his face. He had brown hair, glasses, and facial hair. His van lights were off, but his car was running. I stopped and put my back to a tree in my neighbor's yard, and I just stood there, maintaining eye contact with this man. After about what seemed like eternity, probably like 5 minutes minimum, he starts driving towards the stop sign at the end of the road. I didn't put my back to him. I kept my back to the tree and maintained visual on the van the entire time until it stopped at the stop sign. He just sat there for probably 2 to 3 minutes, all while I'm not looking away and my back is still to the tree. Finally, he turned right, the direction in which I had come from, and after about 20 seconds of making sure he or anybody else wasn't coming, I bolt to my house. I quickly get inside and lock the door. I go to the window and very quietly look through the blinds. I didn't turn my lights on because I'm not stupid, and after a few seconds of looking, he drove back up and down the street and then left again. Afterwards, I texted my roommate what happened, and then went to each and every one of the windows in my house to make sure that they were locked, along with the back door and garage door. I made sure to keep all lights off for the remainder of the night. I didn't sleep a lick that night. I was so paranoid at every sound or movement. Let's just say, I never walked home after that. My granny lived in a cabin on 7 acres in Appalachian, Virginia. No cable or internet. Stand naked in your driveway and the neighbors won't see kind of place. After she died when I was in high school, we moved there. I never found the place creepy, but it scared the ever-loving shit out of all my friends. For some background, my grandmother had been digging and found a very long bone buried in the hillside next to a very old liquor bottle. What that means, I have no idea. The main room of the house had windows that scaled the entirety of both sides. Everyone who visits always says they feel like someone is watching them. It's wooded on one side and mountains on the other. One night, I had 3 friends who were sleeping over. I had passed out without any trouble, but I came to find out that they were all wide awake because they were scared. My parents were asleep. They said they all distinctly heard a coin drop on the floor and roll down the hallway. Another incident that is more disturbing. There was a tunnel about a 1/4 mile up the road from the cabin's driveway. There's nothing to do in that town, and we heard stories of teenagers sacrificing animals there in the 90s. Everyone says the place is demonic. When a couple of the same friends and I were coming up under the tunnel at night, something was in the road, and I almost hit it. It was fleshy and twisted. bigger than a raccoon and smaller than a person. I was driving, so I didn't look back, but my friend turned around and got a better look at it. I, to this day, have no idea what that creature was. I stopped going under the bridge at night, but on another occasion, I was coming under the tunnel by myself in broad daylight. The radio cut out as I was driving into the curve of the tunnel entrance and started playing a very distorted and garbled clip of Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. It sounds funny, but it was chilling. Every hair on my body stood up. As soon as I was away from the bridge, the radio signal came back in. I drove under it all the time and have never had a single issue before or since. I'm pretty sure that entire area was just cursed or something. My boyfriend was born and raised on Jellicoe Mountain in Jellicoe, Tennessee, as was his family for several generations. His dad had a story that he shared before he passed last year, and it's definitely scary as fuck. He was raccoon hunting with a friend when he was a young man, and they heard their dogs get after a raccoon. You all know that deep baying sound they make when they get one, so they heard it, and they start hot-footing it up the mountain, when all of a sudden, these dogs start screaming. They followed the sound and came up on a gigantic black panther, ripping these dogs apart. One dog was already dead, another was injured and trying to crawl away, and the panther was in the process of mauling the last one. They immediately fired their guns at the panther, and for a minute, it acted like it was going to charge them, so they fired again and shot it this time. It ran away, and so did they. They had to come back the next day for the dogs, because this guy refused to leave his dogs to rot. They were his pets, not just hunting hounds. But anyway, when they came back, they brought 6 other people with them, all armed with guns, but they didn't find the panther. 2 of the dogs were still there, but they never found the 3rd dog. It had been dragged off. There were huge panther tracks all around the area, along with blood from the dogs. So that confirmed that they weren't just imagining what they saw. They wrapped the dogs in tarps to drag home to bury, and avoided that particular area for future hunting. They never saw it again, but they never forgot it either. And yes, they were both positive that it was solid black, and seemed larger than a regular panther should be. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you have a scary story you'd like me to read on the channel, please send me an email or post it to my subreddit. You can find details of this in the video description. It's the stories that make this, and this is the best way to ensure variety in the stories I share. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to my channel members and patrons who now have special access to ad-free videos and other behind-the-scenes content. Once again, thank you guys for listening. Have a great night.